All right, welcome. Today, we're going to break down the absolute core framework for pretty much any constitutional law exam here in Hong Kong. We're talking about how you challenge a law that messes with a fundamental right. We're going to walk through the whole journey, step by step. Think of this as your essential roadmap for revision.
Okay, so let's just dive right in with a classic scenario, the kind of thing that pops up in exams all the time. Imagine a new law gets passed, and it steps on your freedom of speech. How in the world does a court actually decide if that law is okay? What are the exact steps they have to follow? Figuring that out? Well, that's what we're here to do.
So we're going to follow the exact same path a court would take. First, we have to figure out what a right even is. Then we'll open up the toolkit and see where we actually find these rights in the law. After that, we hit the core conflict. When can the government limit our rights? And that leads us straight to the main event, the four-step justification test. And finally, we'll see what a court can actually do when a law fails that test.
So, first things first. It makes sense, right? Before you can even start to argue that a right's been violated, you've got to know exactly what it is you're defending.
So, what really is a fundamental right? Well, it's way more than just a rule in a book. The best way to think about it is as a basic moral claim that we all have, something so important it gets written into the law itself. And this puts a really important three-part duty on the government. First, to respect the right, which means not interfering with it. Second, to protect it from being violated by other people. And sometimes even to promote it, to actively create an environment where that right can actually thrive.
Okay, so we know what a right is, but where do we find them? Where do we even look? Let's open up the legal toolkit that lawyers and judges use every day to pinpoint the specific rights that are in play.
In Hong Kong, your toolkit basically has three main drawers. First up, you've got the common law. This gives us really important procedural rights, like the right to a fair trial. But, and this is a big but, these rights aren't entrenched. That means a new piece of legislation can just override them. The most powerful tools in the kit are the Basic Law, our mini-constitution, and the Bill of Rights Ordinance, or BORO. These are entrenched, which means they are superior law. No regular law can violate the rights that are locked inside them.
Now, here's something that is super important, especially for an exam question. These two big documents, the Basic Law and the BOR, they don't actually cover the exact same things. Some really core rights, like the right not to be tortured, you'll only find in the BOR. And other huge ones, like the right of abode, are only in the Basic Law. Knowing exactly where a right lives is critical, because as you'll see in a minute, it changes the rules of the game for how the government is allowed to justify limiting it.
Okay, so this brings us to the central tension in all of constitutional law. It's the ultimate clash between your individual freedom on one side and the interests of society or the state on the other. Because let's face it, very few rights are totally absolute. So there has to be a legal framework to decide when a limitation is actually fair and justified. The gateway for any kind of restriction on a right is found right there in Article 39 of the Basic Law. It says rights can be restricted, but only if that restriction is prescribed by law. Now, that phrase, prescribed by law, seems pretty straightforward, right? Well, nope. The courts have packed a ton of meaning and a whole series of really demanding tests into those three little words. Before we even get to the main test, the person challenging the law has to clear 4 preliminary hurdles. You can think of this as the first part of your exam answer. First, standing. Are you the right person to be suing in the first place? Second, engagement. Is a constitutional right even involved here? Third, interference. Has the government actually done something that affects that right? And finally, what's the nature of the right? Is it an absolute one, which can never be limited, or is it qualified? Only after the applicant proves those first 3 does the ball jump into the government's court to justify what they've done. Okay, so if we've established that a qualified right has been interfered with, the government now has to justify it. And to do that, the law has to survive what's known as the 4-step proportionality test, laid out in the huge Hyson case. This is the big one. This is the analytical gauntlet at the heart of almost every single fundamental rights case. Now, these are the 4 essential headings you need for your analysis. Number 1, does the law have a legitimate purpose, something like protecting public health or national security? 2, is there a rational connection between the law they passed and that purpose? 3, is the measure no more than necessary? In other words, is it the least intrusive way to get the job done? And 4, does the law strike a fair balance between the benefit to society and the harm done to the individual? And get this, the government has to win on all 4 points. Fail one, and the law can fall.
Now, let's zoom in on step 3, no more than necessary, because this is where all the nuance is, and honestly where a lot of people get tripped up. The court doesn't apply this test the same way every time. For big, complex social or economic policies, it uses a pretty lenient manifest standard. It basically gives the government a lot of room to act, but when a core right like freedom of speech or assembly is on the line, the court switches to a much stricter, reasonable necessity standard. Here, the government is put under a microscope and has to prove it shows the least restrictive option possible. It's much, much harder for the government to win. This quote perfectly explains that final step, fair balance. Even if a law has a legitimate aim, is connected to it, and is the least intrusive option, this fourth step is the final backstop. A sort of common sense check. Just imagine a law that allows deadly force to stop someone from shoplifting. It might pass the first 3 steps, but it would totally fail the fair balance test. Why? Because the harm to the individual, the loss of life, is just so grossly out of proportion to the benefit of protecting a little bit of property. So, what happens if a law fails to survive that gauntlet? What can the courts actually do to fix the problem? This brings us to the final stage of our journey, the remedies. One of the first things a court might try is called reading in. This is where the court doesn't just throw the law out. Instead, it actually adds new words to it to expand its meaning just enough to fix the constitutional problem. It's a way of repairing the law rather than scrapping it. A perfect real-world example of this is the famous W case. The law said marriage was between one man and one woman. The court found this unconstitutionally excluded a post-operative transgender woman. So instead of throwing out the entire marriage law, which would have been a huge mess, it effectively read in a broader meaning to the word woman to make the law constitutional. The flip side of reading in is, you guessed it, reading down. Here, instead of adding words, the court takes the words that are already there and gives them a much narrower meaning. So if a law bans, say, all disruptive assemblies, a court might read it down so it only applies to violent disruptive assemblies, saving it from being unconstitutional. Then you've got severance. You can think of this one like a surgeon. If just one clause or one part of a law is unconstitutional, the court can carefully cut out that bad part, the unconstitutional bit, and let the rest of the healthy, valid law survive. But sometimes a law is just so fundamentally flawed that none of these fixes will work. That's when the court has to use its ultimate power, a declaration of invalidity. This is absolutely the last resort, and it's a huge deal for an unelected court to strike down a law made by the elected legislature. It raises all sorts of separation of powers issues, which is exactly why courts really prefer to save laws if they possibly can. And in some really rare and exceptional cases, a court might issue what's called suspended declaration. It will declare a law invalid, but then it hits the pause button on that ruling for a while. It's like the court saying, this law is broken, we're giving you a year to fix it, and then it's gone. This gives the legislature time to draft a new law and avoids a dangerous legal gap, especially in areas like public safety. And that brings us to the end of our roadmap. We've seen where rights come from, how they can be limited, and what courts can do about it. So after all that, it leaves you with a really big question to think about, doesn't it? If our entire legal system has such a detailed, structured process for justifying when our rights can be taken away, what does that tell us about what the word fundamental really means?